Before we dive into this dark chapter of history, I want to connect with you, our viewers. Drop a comment and tell us where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Are you interested in stories of resistance and survival from America's darkest periods? If these untold histories matter to you, hit that subscribe button. It helps us keep bringing these forgotten voices to light. Easter Sunday, April 11, 1852, Magnolia Creek Plantation, Charleston County, South Carolina. The screams started at dawn and didn't stop until every white man on that plantation lay bleeding into the red clay soil. Dinah. That was the name of the woman who, with nothing but kitchen knives and a heart full of calculated fury, carved her way through 6 men who thought they owned her soul. The Spanish moss hung heavy that morning, dripping with dew that looked like tears in the grey light filtering through the live oaks. The air smelled of magnolia blossoms and something darker, the metallic tang of what was about to come. Dinah was 34 years old, born on that same plantation dirt, raised in the shadow of the big white house with its sprawling porches and perfect columns. She had hands that knew every secret of the kitchen, fingers that could turn flour and lard into biscuits light as air, eyes that had watched 20 years of cruelty served up alongside Sunday dinner. They trained her to cook, to serve, to smile when the masters spoke. But what they actually created was something far more dangerous. A woman who knew exactly where every sharp blade lived, who understood the rhythm of the plantation like her own heartbeat, who remembered every single thing they had taken from her. Master William Grayson owned her body. His son Robert owned her labor. The overseer Jackson owned her fear, or so they thought. But this Easter morning, Dinah was about to ash them who really controlled this kitchen, this house, this blood-soaked piece of Carolina earth. The names that would fall today: William Grayson, Robert Grayson, Jackson the overseer, Thomas Whitfield the neighboring planter, Samuel Brooks who dealt in human flesh, and young Matthew Crane who thought breaking people was sport. This is the true story of Dinah, the cook who served death on Easter morning and showed the world that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a gun or a whip. It's patience, knowledge, and a woman who has absolutely nothing left to lose. The kitchen was her domain, had been for 15 years, ever since old Master William decided she had steady enough hands to work the big house instead of picking cotton until her fingers bled. The brick floors stayed cool even in summer. The massive fireplace could roast a whole pig. And the knives. God, the knives hung from their hooks like silver promises along the far wall. Dinah moved through that space like water, quiet and sure. She knew which floorboard creaked third from the stove, knew that the pantry door swung left if you didn't lift it just right, knew that sound carried up through the ceiling straight into Master William's study. Knowledge was power when you had nothing else, and Dinah had been collecting knowledge for 34 years. The plantation stretched for 3,000 acres, cotton fields rolling away toward the Ashley River like a green and white ocean. 300 souls worked that land, bent backs and bleeding hands feeding the Grayson fortune. But it was the big house where the real cruelty lived, where the men who owned everything gathered to drink whiskey and plan new ways to break spirits that were already cracked. Master William Grayson was 58, thin as a fence post with hands like bird claws and eyes the color of dirty ice. He had owned Dinah since the day she drew breath, bought her mother Sarah in 1817 when cotton prices were high and conscience was cheap. William never raised his voice, didn't need to. He spoke in whispers that cut deeper than screams, smiled when he ordered whippings, touched his mustache when he was deciding who lived and who died. His son Robert was worse. 26 years old, with his father's pale eyes and his grandfather's taste for cruelty. Robert had soft hands and a softer belly, but there was nothing soft about the way he looked at the women who worked his land. He collected people like some men collected horses, broke them like some men broke wild things, threw them away when the breaking got boring. Jackson ran the fields with a leather whip and a mouthful of tobacco juice. 43 years old, built like a tree stump, with scars across his knuckles from beating slaves and marks on his soul from enjoying it. He slept in the overseer's house, ate at the big house table, and pretended he was anything more than another kind of slave, one who sold his humanity for 3 meals a day and the right to hurt people weaker than himself. The morning started wrong. It was Easter Sunday, supposed to be about resurrection and redemption, but the air tasted like storm and the wind carried something bitter from the cotton fields. Dinah rose before dawn, same as always, to start the breakfast that would feed the men who owned her world. Biscuits and gravy, ham thick as a prayer book, coffee strong enough to wake the dead. But this morning, 3 more men sat at the long table in the dining room. Guests meant extra work, extra watching, extra chances for things to go sideways. Thomas Whitfield owned the plantation 10 miles north, a fat man with yellow teeth who laughed too loud and touched too much. Samuel Brooks dealt in human flesh, bought and sold families like cattle, had hands that smelled like silver coins and tears. And Matthew Crane, barely 22, son of a Charleston merchant who thought art owning people was a game worth playing. They came to talk business, buying, selling, trading lives like poker chips. Dinah knew because she heard everything. When you're invisible to the people who own you, you learn secrets they never meant to share. She knew Master William was selling 12 people to pay debts, knew Robert wanted to buy fresh stock from the Charleston markets, knew they were planning to separate families, split children from mothers, husbands from wives, because broken people worked harder and ran less. The conversation floated up from the dining room while Dinah worked, their voices mixing with the sound of silver on china, laughter punctuating the casual discussion of human misery. They talked about her people like livestock, debated ages and strength and breeding potential, while she carved ham with a knife sharp enough to split hairs. But it wasn't the business talk that broke something inside Dinah's chest. It was when she heard her own name mixed in with the negotiations. Robert's voice smooth as butter and twice as slick. "What about the cook? Dinah's getting on, but she's got good years left. Whitfield, you need kitchen help." The silence stretched like a held breath. Then Master William's whisper, carrying up through the floorboards. "Dinah stays, for now, but her daughter Sarah..." Sarah, named for Dinah's mother, dead these 5 years. Sarah, who was 16 and beautiful and everything good that Dinah had managed to protect in this place of broken spirits and stolen lives. "The girl's ripe," Robert continued, and Dinah's hand tightened on the knife handle. "Crane, you're setting up that new place. Need house servants. Young ones train better." Dinah had to grip the counter to keep standing. They were selling Sarah, her baby girl who still hummed while she worked, who still believed prayers might be answered, who still looked at her mother like she hung the moon and stars. They were going to rip her away, send her to Matthew Crane's plantation, where young girls went to have their spirits broken in ways that left scars on the soul. The men were still talking, still laughing, still eating the food Dinah had prepared with hands that were now shaking with something that felt like earthquake and fire. She moved to the window, looked out across the yard where Sarah was hanging laundry, her brown arms reaching up to pin white sheets to the line. Beautiful Sarah, who deserved better than this world of chains and cruelty, who deserved a future that didn't involve being sold like livestock to men who thought breaking people was entertainment. That's when Dinah felt something shift inside her chest. Not break, shift. Like a door sliding open to reveal a room she'd kept locked for 34 years. A room full of rage and planning and the kind of cold determination that could burn down the world. She had promised Sarah's grandmother, her own mother Sarah, on her deathbed 5 years ago. Promised to keep the girl safe, to find a way out, to make sure Sarah never ended up like so many others, used up and thrown away before her 20th birthday. It was a promise carved into Dinah's heart with the same precision she used to carve Sunday roasts. The knives hung on their hooks, waiting. 6 men sat at the table downstairs, planning to destroy the only thing Dinah had left to love. And for the first time in her life, Dinah felt something more powerful than fear coursing through her veins. She didn't cry. She just started planning. The past was a weight Dinah carried in her bones, memories stacked like cordwood in her chest. She remembered every face, every name, every person this plantation had chewed up and spit out. Her mother Sarah worked to death in the cotton fields when Dinah was 29. Her brother Moses sold south when he got 2, proud and too strong. Her first daughter Ruth dead of fever at age 3 because the doctor wouldn't come for slave children. Her husband Samuel killed trying to run when Ruth died, and grief made him foolish. 24 people she had loved, gone. Some dead, some sold, some run off into the swamps where the dogs and the bounty hunters waited. But Sarah, her living daughter Sarah, was still here, still whole, still carrying that spark that made Dinah believe there might be something good left in this poisoned world. The Graysons had taken everything else. They had taken her childhood, her family, her freedom, her body, when Robert decided he had rights to more than just her labor. They had taken her dignity, her hope, her belief that tomorrow might be better than today. They had taken 24 people she loved and ground them down into nothing but painful memories and empty spaces at the dinner table. But they would not take Sarah, not while Dinah still drew breath. She remembered the day Robert first looked at Sarah with those pale Grayson eyes. Sarah was 14, just starting to show the woman she would become, and Robert watched her like a hawk watches a rabbit. Dinah saw that look and felt something cold and sharp settle in her stomach. She knew what it meant. Had seen it too many times before. She started planning that very day. Not the killing, not yet, but the protection. She taught Sarah to walk different, to keep her eyes down, to make herself small and invisible. She traded her own Sunday rest to take on Sarah's heaviest work, keeping the girl close to the big house where there were always eyes watching, always people around. She made sure Sarah was never alone with Robert, never caught in dark corners or empty rooms where terrible things happened to girls who couldn't fight back. For 2 years, it worked. Sarah stayed safe, stayed whole, innocent in a place where innocence was a luxury nobody could afford. But Dinah knew it couldn't last forever. She could see Robert's patience wearing thin, could feel the pressure building like water behind a dam. And now, this Easter morning, the dam was about to burst. The conversation downstairs grew louder as the whiskey started flowing. She could hear Robert's voice getting meaner, Master William's laughter getting sharper, the guests getting bolder in their talk about who they owned and what they planned to do with their property. They spoke about Sarah like she was a horse to be broken, a field to be plowed, a thing with no feelings, no dreams, no right to choose her own fate. Dinah's hands moved without thinking, preparing the noon meal while her mind traveled back through 34 years of accumulated rage. Every insult, every beating, every family torn apart, every child sold, every woman broken, every man killed for the crime of wanting to be free. The memories stacked up like kindling, and now Robert's plan to take Sarah was the spark that would set it all burning. She thought about her mother's hands, worn down to bone and gristle from picking cotton, about her brother Moses, proud and strong and stubborn, disappearing into a slave trader's wagon when Dinah was 17, about little Ruth, burning with fever while the white doctor refused to come because colored children weren't worth his time, about Samuel, her husband, her heart, shot down like a dog when grief made him desperate enough to run. Ruth would have been 18 now. Moses would have been 41. Samuel would have been 50, his hair going grey, his hands still gentle despite all the hardness he'd endured. Sarah's grandmother would have been 67, still singing the songs she remembered from Africa, still keeping the old stories alive. All of them gone. All of them stolen by the Grayson family and their friends, their business partners, by a whole system of buying and selling human souls like bags of cotton or barrels of rice. But Sarah was still here. Sarah, who hummed while she worked, who still believed in tomorrow, who looked at her mother like Dinah had hung the stars. Sarah, who deserved better than this world of chains and cruelty, who deserved a future that didn't involve being sold to Matthew Crane like livestock at market. The kitchen knives caught the light filtering through the window. 6 blades, each one sharp enough to carve meat from bone, each one waiting for the right hand to give it purpose. Dinah had spent 15 years learning those knives, understanding their weight and balance, knowing exactly how much pressure it took to cut through gristle and sinew and the tough parts that fought back. She looked out at Sarah, hanging laundry in the yard, her daughter's voice carrying on the breeze as she sang one of the old songs their grandmother had taught them. Sarah didn't know yet. Didn't know about the conversation happening downstairs, didn't know about Matthew Crane and his plans for young house servants, didn't know that her whole world was about to be ripped apart by men who thought they had the right to own other people's lives. Dinah would not let Sarah find out. would not let her baby girl become another broken thing in a world full of broken things, would not let the Graysons take the last good thing she had left to love. The promise she'd made to her mother echoed in her mind. Keep Sarah safe. Find a way out. Don't let them break her like they broke us. For 5 years, Dinah had tried to keep that promise the safe way. Through submission, through careful planning, through making herself and Sarah invisible enough to avoid the worst of the plantation's cruelty. But safe wasn't working anymore. Safe had failed the moment Robert decided Sarah was old enough to sell. If she couldn't keep Sarah safe through submission, then she would keep her safe through blood. The breaking point came at exactly 12:15 on Easter Sunday, 1852. Dinah knew because she was watching the clock on the kitchen mantel when Robert Grayson walked into her domain and spoke the words that sealed 6 men's fate. "Pack your daughter's things, Dinah. Crane's taking her tomorrow morning." Just like that. Casual as ordering coffee, simple as discussing the weather. Robert stood in her kitchen doorway, his pale eyes flat and cold, his soft hands picking at a piece of ham he'd stolen from the serving platter. He didn't look at Dinah when he spoke, didn't acknowledge that he was destroying a life with his words. To him, it was just business, moving property from one location to another. "Sir?" Dinah's voice came out steady, though her heart was hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. "You heard me. The girl goes to Crane's place tomorrow. He needs house servants, and she's the right age to train proper." Robert bit into the ham, chewed thoughtfully. "Don't give me that look, Dinah. It's a good position. Better than field work." Better than field work. As if being sold to a 22-year-old who thought breaking people was sport could ever be better than anything. As if Sarah deserved to be grateful for the privilege of being owned by someone new. "Please, Master Robert." The words tasted like ashes in Dinah's mouth. "Sarah's a good worker. She helps me with the cooking, with the cleaning. You need her here." Robert finally looked at her then, and what Dinah saw in those pale eyes made her stomach turn to ice. Not anger, that would have been better. What she saw was amusement. He was enjoying this, enjoying the power, the control, the knowledge that he could destroy lives with a few casual words, and there wasn't a damn thing anyone could do to stop him. "I don't need anything, Dinah. I want. And what I want is the money Crane's paying for fresh stock." He smiled, and it was the kind of smile that belonged on a snake. "Besides, the girl's getting ideas. Saw her talking to that new field hand, the one with the scars on his back. Can't have my property thinking they get to choose their own company." James. Sarah had been talking to James, the young man Master William bought 3 months ago from a plantation in Georgia. A quiet boy, maybe 19, with gentle eyes and horrible scars across his shoulders from whatever hell he'd escaped. Sarah had been sneaking him extra food, bandages for the wounds that wouldn't heal right, small kindnesses that made both of them smile in a world that offered precious few reasons to smile. And Robert had been watching, had seen those small moments of human connection, and decided they needed to be crushed before they grew into something he couldn't control. "She's just being kind, Master Robert. Christian charity, like the Bible says." Robert laughed, and the sound was like breaking glass. "Christian charity? Is that what you people call it when you start getting ideas above your station?" He moved closer, and Dinah could smell the whiskey on his breath, the cologne that couldn't quite cover the scent of cruelty that clung to him like smoke. "Let me explain something to you, Dinah. Your daughter doesn't get to be kind to anyone I don't approve of. She doesn't get to talk to field hands or smile at stable boys or think she has any say in who she spends time with. She's property, my property, and tomorrow she becomes Crane's property. End of discussion." Something cold and sharp settled in Dinah's chest. Not fear. She'd lived with fear so long it felt like another organ in her body. This was something else. Something that felt like winter morning air and the edge of a blade, and the moment when you realize there's no going back. "What about my promise to her grandmother?" The words came out before Dinah could stop them. "I promised Sarah, as grandmother, I'd keep her safe." Robert's eyebrows rose. "Your promise?" He said it like the words were foreign, like the idea that a slave might make promises was too ridiculous to comprehend. "Dinah, you don't get to make promises about my property. You don't get to decide what's safe or what's not. You cook my food, you clean my house, you do what you're told. That's it." He turned to leave, then stopped at the doorway. "Pack her things, Dinah. And don't even think about trying to hide her or help her run. You know what happens to runaways. You know what happens to the people who help them." Then he was gone, leaving Dinah alone in her kitchen with the knives hanging on their hooks and a rage so pure it felt like religious experience. She stood there for exactly 1 minute, counting her heartbeats, feeling something fundamental shift inside her chest. For 34 years, she had survived by being small, by being quiet, by accepting whatever cruelty the world decided to heap on her shoulders. She had watched her family get torn apart piece by piece, had swallowed her rage and her grief and her desperate desire for justice because fighting back meant death, and death meant abandoning the people who still needed her protection. But this was different. This was Sarah, her baby, her heart, her last reason for believing there might be something good left in this poisoned world. They were going to take Sarah and break her the way they broke everything else, and there wasn't going to be anything left of the girl who hummed while she worked and still believed prayers might be answered. Dinah looked at the knives hanging on their hooks, 6 blades sharp enough to carve truth from lies and justice from cruelty. She thought about the men sitting around the dining room table, drinking whiskey and planning to destroy lives like it was a game. She thought about Robert's pale eyes and his casual cruelty, about Master William's whispered threats and Jackson's leather whip, about the guests who came to buy and sell human souls. 6 men who thought they owned the W, bald. 6 men who had never faced real consequences for the pain they caused. 6 men who were about to learn that sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone thinks is powerless. Dinah didn't cry. She didn't scream. She didn't fall to her knees and beg a God who seemed to have forgotten her people existed. She just reached for the first knife and started planning. The weapon wasn't meant for carving roasts. It was meant for carving justice. The afternoon stretched long and golden, Easter Sunday light filtering through the kitchen windows like honey through cheesecloth. Dinah moved through her normal routine, clearing lunch dishes, preparing the evening meal, keeping her hands busy while her mind worked with the cold precision of a clockmaker setting gears in motion. The men were drunk now. She could hear their voices getting louder, their laughter getting meaner, their words slurring together as they discussed their business of buying and selling human flesh. They would want coffee soon, and whiskey, and the special Easter cake she'd been preparing for 3 days. They would want to be served and pampered and treated like the kings they thought they were. And Dinah would serve them one last time. She checked the knives, 6 blades hanging on their hooks, each one tested daily for sharpness, each one balanced and weighted for different tasks. The cleaver for heavy work, broad and brutal, the carving knife for precision cuts, thin and flexible, the boning knife for delicate work, narrow and sharp as a needle, the butcher knife for power, thick and unforgiving, the fillet knife for finesse, curved and graceful, the paring knife for detail work, small but deadly accurate. 6 knives, 6 men, perfect mathematics. Sarah was still in the yard, still hanging laundry, still humming the old songs. She didn't know yet. Dinah would make sure so. He never had to know, never had to understand what monsters were planning for her future. Some knowledge was too heavy for young shoulders to carry. Through the window, Dinah could see James working in the vegetable garden, his scarred back bent over the tomato plants, his gentle hands coaxing life from the dirt. He was the kind of man Sarah deserved, kind, strong, broken by this world, but not destroyed by it. Under different circumstances, in a different world, maybe they could have had something beautiful together. But this wasn't a different world. This was South Carolina in 1852, where love between slaves was a luxury that could be bought and sold and torn apart whenever white men needed money or entertainment. James would probably be sold too, once Robert decided he was too dangerous to keep around. Young men with hope in their eyes and scars on their backs made masters nervous. The clock on the mantel chimed 4 times. 2 hours until evening meal, 3 hours until the guests would be good and drunk, 4 hours until the plantation settled into its evening rhythm. Dinah knew every sound this place made after dark, knew when the overseers made their rounds, knew when the big house went quiet and stayed quiet until dawn. She began her preparations with the same methodical care she brought to every meal. But this time, she wasn't cooking food, she was cooking justice, and justice required different ingredients. First, she gathered information. The men in the dining room had been drinking since noon, their voices carrying clearly through the floorboards. Master William was the careful one, still nursing his second glass while the others got sloppy. Robert was mean drunk, his voice getting sharper with each sip, his casual cruelty turning active and vicious. Jackson was loud drunk, telling stories about runaways he'd caught and the creative ways he'd punished them. The guests were business drunk, their conversation turning to prices and profits and the best markets for different types of human merchandise. Second, she planned the route. The big house had been built for entertaining, with wide hallways and multiple entrances, servants' stairs that connected the kitchen to every floor. Dinah knew every creaking board, every door that stuck, every window that could be opened silently. She had been moving through this house like a ghost for 15 years, and tonight, that invisibility would be her greatest weapon. Third, she prepared her tools. 6 knives, cleaned and sharpened and tested for balance. Each one assigned to a specific task, a specific target. She wrapped them in kitchen towels, soft bundles that would muffle any sound, hide any gleam of metal that might give her away. Fourth, she made peace with what was coming. This wasn't anger anymore. Anger was hot and loud and messy. This was something colder, more precise. This was mathematics and physics, and the simple application of force to achieve a desired result. 6 problems that needed solving. 6 obstacles between Sarah and safety. The sun was setting, painting the kitchen walls gold and crimson. Easter Sunday, the day of resurrection and redemption, the day when the dead were supposed to rise and the righteous were supposed to find justice. How fitting that it would also be the day when Dinah finally stopped being a victim and became something far more dangerous. She could see Sarah in the yard, folding the last of the laundry, her movements graceful and sure. 16 years old, beautiful and innocent, and everything good that had somehow survived in this place of broken spirits and stolen dreams. Tomorrow, Robert and Crane had planned to start breaking her, had planned to turn her into another casualty of their casual cruelty. But tomorrow was going to be very different from what they expected. The dining room erupted in laughter. Something Jackson had said about a runaway who'd lost his feet to dog. The sound cut through Dinah's chest like a blade, and she felt that cold certainty settle deeper in her bones. These men laughed at suffering. They found entertainment in agony. They built their wealth on broken bodies and shattered families, and treated human misery like a joke to be shared over whiskey and cigars. Well, tonight they were going to learn what real suffering looked like. Tonight they were going to discover that sometimes the people you think are powerless have been saving up their power for exactly the right moment. Dinah reached for the cleaver first. Heavy and broad, designed for chopping through bone and gristle, perfect for sending a message that couldn't be ignored or misunderstood. She thought about her mother Sarah, worked to death in the cotton fields, about her brother Moses, sold south and never seen again, about little Ruth, dead of fever because white doctors wouldn't treat slave children, about Samuel, shot down like a dog for wanting to be free. She thought about all the names she carried in her heart, all the faces that haunted her dreams, all the people this plantation had chewed up and spit out like pieces of meat. But mostly, she thought about Sarah. Her living daughter Sarah, who still hummed while she worked, who still believed in tomorrow, who deserved better than this world of chains and cruelty. The cleaver felt good in her hand, heavy and sure and sharp enough to cut through anything that stood between a mother and her child's freedom. Dinah didn't cry. She didn't pray. She didn't hesitate. She just started walking toward the dining room, carrying justice wrapped in kitchen towels, moving like a shadow through the house where she'd spent 34 years being treated like property instead of a person. The reckoning was about to begin. 7:30 on Easter evening. The sun had set behind the live oaks, leaving the big house wrapped in purple shadows and lamplight. The dining room glowed warm and golden. 6 men around the long table, crystal glasses catching firelight, silver forks scraping against china plates. They had moved on from business to pleasure, from whiskey to brandy, from casual cruelty to active malice. Dinah stood in the kitchen doorway, watching them through the serving hatch that connected her world to theirs. Master William at the head of the table, thin and pale as winter, his bird-claw hands wrapped around a snifter of brandy. Robert to his right, flushed with drink and power, his soft belly straining against his vest. Jackson across from Robert, tobacco juice staining his beard, leather whip coiled at his feet like a sleeping snake. The guests had settled in for a long evening. Thomas Whitfield, fat and yellow-toothed, telling stories about the creative punishments he used on disobedient slaves. Samuel Brooks, silver-haired and cold-eyed, calculating the profit margins on human misery with the precision of a banker. Matthew Crane, barely 22, listening to their war stories with the eager attention of a student learning from masters. They were discussing Sarah again, planning her future like she was livestock, debating her best uses with the casual expertise of men who had spent their lives treating people like property. Crane was asking questions about her temperament, her training, her potential for bearing children who could be raised as house servants. The conversation made Dinah's skin crawl, but she listened to every word, memorized every detail, let their casual cruelty feed the cold fire burning in her chest. "The girl's got good bloodlines," Robert was saying, his words slightly slurred. "Mother's been house-trained since birth, knows her place, never given us trouble. Daughter should breed true." Breed true? Like Sarah was a horse or a dog instead of a 16-year-old girl with dreams and hopes and a voice like morning sunlight. Like her value could be measured in potential offspring and domestic obedience instead of the joy she brought to every room she entered. "What about the father's line?" Crane asked, leaning forward with interest. "Any problems with rebellion, running, bad attitudes?" Master William smiled, and the expression looked like death warmed over. "Father's dead. Tried to run after we sold their first child. Made it about 3 miles before the dogs brought him back. Jackson here put him down like the animal he was." Jackson nodded, patting his whip with obvious pride. "Clean shot through the heart. Dropped him right there in Cypress Creek. Left him for the gators." Samuel. They were talking about Samuel, her husband, Sarah's father, the gentlest man Dinah had ever known. Reduced to nothing but a cautionary tale, a warning about what happened to slaves who forgot their place. They had killed him for loving his daughter too much to watch her be sold away from everything she knew, and now they were using his death as a selling point for his surviving child. The rage in Dinah's chest turned white-hot, then crystallized into something harder than diamond and twice as sharp. These men hadn't just stolen her family. They had turned her family's love into a marketing advantage, transformed Samuel's grief into a guarantee of Sarah's compliance. That was when she knew, with absolute certainty, that every single one of them was going to die tonight. She moved through the kitchen like water, gathering her tools, checking her route, making final preparations. The cleaver went into the pocket of her apron, its handle wrapped in cloth to prevent noise. The carving knife slid into her belt, hidden by the folds of her dress. The boning knife found a home in her sleeve, easily accessible but invisible to casual observation. The other knives would wait in the kitchen until she needed them. This wasn't about speed, it was about precision. Each man would die with the right tool for the job, each death crafted to send exactly the message Dinah intended. She started with Jackson because he was the loudest, the drunkest, and the most likely to cause pros. Blems if he realized what was happening. The overseer was telling another story about runaway slaves, his voice booming through the dining room, his hands gesturing wildly as he described the creative tortures he'd inflicted on captured escapees. Dinah entered the dining room carrying a silver tray loaded with coffee and brandy, moving with the invisible efficiency that 15 years of service had perfected. She was furniture to these men, background noise, a convenient shadow that appeared when needed and vanished when dismissed. None of them looked at her face. None of them acknowledged her presence as she moved around the table, refilling glasses and emptying ashtrays. She saved Jackson for last, approaching him from behind while he was deep in his story about a runaway who'd lost his ears to punishment. The cleaver came out smooth and silent, its broad blade catching lamplight for just a moment before Dinah brought it down with all the force 34 years of suppressed rage could provide. The blade took Jackson in the base of the skull, splitting bone and brainstem with the wet sound of an axe biting deep into green wood. He pitched forward into his plate, blood and whiskey mixing on the white tablecloth, his story ending mid-sentence with a gurgle that sounded like water draining from a broken pipe. For a moment, nobody moved. The other 5 men stared at Jackson's body with the stunned incomprehension of people whose world had just shifted on its axis. They had never seen successful rebellion, never faced real consequences for their cruelty, never imagined that the people they owned might own something deadlier than resentment. Robert recovered first, his pale eyes widening as they tracked from Jackson's corpse to the bloody cleaver in Dinah's hand. "What the hell?" The carving knife took him in the throat before he could finish the question. Its thick end blade sliding between vertebrae with the precision of 15 years spent butchering meat for the master's table. Robert's words turned to bloody foam, his hands clawing at his neck while his life pumped out between his fingers. He fell sideways out of his chair, his body hitting the floor with the heavy thud of dead weight. 2 down, 4 to go. Master William was reaching for the bell rope, the one that would summon help from the kitchen, from the overseer's house, from anywhere on the plantation where men with guns might hear the call. But Dinah was already moving, the boning knife leaving her sleeve like liquid silver, finding the soft spot between William's ribs with the unerring accuracy of a woman who had spent her life knowing exactly where every vital organ lived in the bodies of the creatures she prepared for consumption. William's mouth opened in a perfect O of surprise, his bird-claw hands clutching at the knife handle protruding from his chest. Blood bubbled between his lips, and his pale eyes finally focused on Dinah's face with something that might have been recognition. For the first time in 34 years, Master William was really seeing her. Not as property, not as furniture, but as a human being with the power to end his life. "Dinah," he whispered, and her name sounded different in his mouth. Not a command or a dismissal, but a question, maybe even a plea. She looked into those pale eyes that had watched her family get torn apart, that had seen 34 years of her suffering and felt nothing but mild satisfaction. "Yes, Master William, it's me." Then she twisted the knife, and William Grayson died with her name on his lips and the knowledge that his property had finally decided to collect what it was owed. 3 down, 3 to go. The remaining guests had finally processed what was happening, their brandy-fogged minds catching up to the reality that the quiet cook was systematically murdering everyone at the table. Whitfield was scrambling for the door, his fat body moving with surprising speed for a man who spent his days sitting behind a desk counting human misery like poker chips. Brooks was reaching for something in his jacket, a pistol probably, because men like him always carried insurance against the people they oppressed. Crane was just sitting there, his young face white as paper, his mouth working soundlessly like a fish pulled from water. Dinah let Whitfield reach the doorway before the butcher knife took him in the back, its heavy blade punching through ribs and lung and heart with the brutal efficiency of a tool designed for breaking down large animals. He pitched forward into the hallway, his yellow teeth clicking against the hardwood floor, his last breath whistling out through the hole in his chest. Brooks had his pistol halfway out of his jacket when the fillet knife found his wrist, its curved blade parting tendons and arteries with surgical precision. The gun clattered to the floor as Brooks screamed, clutching his ruined hand against his chest, silver hair wild with terror and pain. "Please," he gasped, and the words sounded strange coming from a man who had built his fortune on the suffering of people who had begged him for mercy countless times. "Please, I have money. I can pay." "With what?" Dinah's voice was calm as still water, steady as the hands that had fed these men for 15 years. "With the profits from selling my people? With the money you made tearing families apart?" Brooks opened his mouth to answer, but the fillet knife was already moving again, its blade opening his throat with the delicate precision of someone who had spent her life preparing meat for other people's consumption. He fell across the table, blood spreading across white linen like spilled wine. 5 down, 1 to go. Matthew Crane sat frozen in his chair, his 22-year-old face a mask of terror. Raw and incomprehension. He had come here to buy a house servant, to add human property to his new plantation, to join the ranks of men who owned other people's lives. Instead, he was watching those men die one by one at the hands of the woman they had dismissed as harmless, invisible, powerless. "You were going to buy my daughter," Dinah said, moving around the table toward him with the slow inevitability of sunrise. The paring knife appeared in her hand, small but sharp as a whispered threat. "You were going to take Sarah away from everything she knows, break her spirit, use her body, throw her away when you got bored." Crane's mouth worked soundlessly for a moment before he found his voice. I didn't. It was just business. Just business." Dinah repeated the words like they were foreign, like she was trying to understand a language that had no meaning. "My daughter's life. Just business." She thought about Sarah humming in the yard, hanging laundry in the golden afternoon light, still believing in tomorrow because she didn't know what men like Crane had planned for her future. She thought about Ruth, her first daughter, dead at 3 because white doctors wouldn't treat slave children. She thought about Samuel, shot down like a dog for loving his family too much to watch it be destroyed. All of it was just business to you, Dinah continued, her voice soft as prayer and twice as deadly. My mother's death, my brother's sale, my husband's murder, my children's suffering. Just numbers in your ledger books, just profits to be counted and costs to be calculated. The paring knife moved with the precision of 34 years, spent preparing meals for the master's table, its small blade finding the spaces between ribs, the soft places where life lived closest to the surface. Crane died quietly, without drama, his young life leaking out through wounds too small to see, but too deep to survive. 6 men, 6 knives. Perfect mathematics. Dinah stood in the dining room surrounded by the bodies of her oppressor, blood on her hands and justice in her heart. The silence was profound, broken only by the ticking of the mantel clock and the distant sound of night birds calling from the live oaks. For the first time in 34 years, the big house felt peaceful. She cleaned her knives methodically, washing each blade until it gleamed silver bright in the lamplight, hanging them back on their hooks in the kitchen where they belonged. The blood would wash out of her dress with cold water and lye soap. The memories would stay with her forever. Outside, Sarah was probably wondering why the big house had gone so quiet, why the usual sounds of evening entertainment had stopped so suddenly. Soon, very soon, Dinah would have to tell her daughter that they were free, not legally, not officially, but free in the way that mattered most. Free from the men who had planned to destroy their family, free from the immediate threat of separation and sale, free to run or fight or die together instead of being torn apart by the casual cruelty of the slave system. The aftermath would be swift and brutal. By morning, the plantation would be swarming with armed men, hunting dogs, and righteous fury. They would find the bodies, they would find the evidence, they would find Dinah and Sarah and make them pay for the crime of refusing to be property any longer. But that was tomorrow's problem. Tonight, for the first time in 34 years, Dinah felt something that might have been peace settling into her bones. She had kept her promise to Sarah's grandmother. She had protected her daughter. She had shown the world that sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a gun or a whip, but a woman who has absolutely nothing left to lose. The house was quiet now. The men who had owned it, who had used it as headquarters for their business of buying and selling human souls, would never hurt anyone again. Their voices were silenced forever. Their plans reduced to nothing but cooling corpses and the metallic smell of justice finally served. Dinah walked to the window and looked out at the yard where Sarah was still folding laundry, still humming the old songs, still beautiful and innocent and everything good that had somehow survived in this place of broken spirits and stolen dreams. Tomorrow would bring consequences. Tonight brought peace. It was enough. The dawn came blood red through the live oaks, Easter Monday morning painting the plantation in shades of copper and gold. The big house stood silent as a tomb, its windows dark, its porches empty of the usual morning bustle of servants preparing for another day of service. Dinah sat on the kitchen steps, still wearing her blood-stained dress, watching the sun rise over land that had drunk the blood of 6 men and finally tasted justice. Sarah sat beside her, her young hand clasped in her mother's weathered fingers, both of them quiet in the way that comes after storms, when the wind has died and the world feels clean and new. They had talked through the night, mother and daughter. Voices soft as whispered prayers in the kitchen where it all began. Dinah had told Sarah everything. About the plans to sell her, about the years of accumulated rage, about the promise made to a dying grandmother, and finally kept with blood and steel. Sarah had cried at first, then grown quiet, then nodded with the solemn understanding of a girl who had always known this day would come in one form or another. The dogs would arrive soon. Armed men from neighboring plantations, slave catchers with their bloodhounds and their casual expertise in hunting human beings. The law would demand justice for the deaths of 6 white men, and that justice would be swift and brutal and final. There would be no trial, no chance to explain or defend or justify. The system that had kept them enslaved would not tolerate this level of successful rebellion. But they had won something that couldn't be taken away, even by rope and fire. They had won the knowledge that the people who owned them weren't untouchable, weren't gods, weren't beyond the reach of consequence. They had proven that sometimes love was stronger than fear, that sometimes a mother's promise was worth more than safety, that sometimes the most powerless person in the room was actually the most dangerous. "Do you regret it?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible over the morning bird song. Dinah considered the question, thinking about the weight of 34 years, the faces of the people she had lost, the sound of her daughter's voice still carrying hope, despite everything this world had tried to do to break her spirit. "No," she said finally. "I regret that it took me so long." The story spread like wildfire through the slave quarters of South Carolina, whispered from plantation to plantation, carried by field hands and house servants and the countless invisible people who made the South's economy possible. They called her the Easter Angel, the kitchen knife lady, the mother who kept her promise. They told her story around hidden fires and in secret meetings, passing down the details like gospel truth. 6 men with a single woman and 6 knives. 6 oppressors who learned too late that the people they owned were human beings with human hearts and human rage and human capacity for love so fierce it could burn down the world. The official records called it a slave uprising, a tragic incident, an example of why the peculiar institution required constant vigilance. But the people who lived in the quarters knew better. They knew it wasn't an uprising. It was a mother protecting her child. They knew it wasn't tragic. It was justice delayed, but not denied. They knew it wasn't an example of why slavery was necessary. It was proof that slavery was doomed. Dinah became legend before she became martyr. Her name joined the whispered pantheon of resistance heroes, spoken in the same breath as Nat Turner and Denmark Vesey and all the others who had chosen death over submission. But her story was different, more personal, more intimate. It wasn't about grand political statements or religious visions. It was about a mother's love and a promise kept, and the simple, terrible mathematics of 6 knives and 6 men who thought they were beyond reach of consequence. They caught her, of course. 3 days after Easter, the dogs found her and Sarah hiding in the cypress swamps, living on roots and creek water, and the stubborn determination of people who had tasted freedom and refused to give it back. The end was swift and predictable. Rope and fire and the ritualized violence that the slave system used to maintain control through terror. But by then, the story had already taken root. By then, the whispered tales were spreading through the quarters like kudzu, impossible to kill, growing stronger with each telling. By then, other mothers were looking at their own children and making their own promises and sharpening their own knives. The Easter Rising at Magnolia Creek Plantation became more than just a story about one woman's revenge. It became a parable about the price of oppression, a warning about what happens when human beings are pushed beyond their breaking point, a reminder that love can be the most dangerous force in the world when it has nothing left to lose. Years later, when the war came and the plantation system finally collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions, people remembered Dinah's story. They remembered that resistance was possible, that the powerful could be made to pay for their cruelty, that sometimes a mother's promise was worth more than safety or survival or the careful calculus of staying alive in an impossible world. If this story haunts you, it's because it should. If it makes you think about the cost of human freedom and the price of human dignity, it's because those costs are always higher than we want to admit. If it reminds you that the most dangerous person in any room might be the one everyone assumes is powerless, it's because power has always lived in unexpected places, carried by unexpected people, wielded in unexpected ways. Subscribe and share this story with those who understand that history isn't just about kings and wars and great movements, but about individual moments of choice, individual acts of courage, individual people who decided that some things are worth dying for and some promises are worth keeping, no matter what. The kitchen knives still hang on their hooks in museums now, cleaned and polished and labeled with careful historical context. But if you know how to listen, you can still hear the echo of Dinah's story in their silent steel. A mother's love, a promise kept, and the sound of justice finally being served.